What's up, everyone? Your friend Mosey coming to you once again, this time with a largely forgotten blast from the past. I dug up in my studies this book, which was allegedly published as a manifesto regarding the Chicano people and analyzing them through a Marxist-Leninist lens, something which, in my opinion, didn't happen enough in the revolutionary era, talking of course about the late 60s and the 70s. You know, a lot of socialist sympathizers are aware of the Black Panther Party and other groups and their ties and contribution to the communist movement out here in the US. But not too many are aware that several other nationalities and ethnic groups had that too. As a testament, we have this work, Fan the Flames, a revolutionary position on the Chicano national question, published by the August 29th movement Marxist-Leninists. But just who were the August 29th movement Marxist-Leninists? Well, according to my research, they were a coalition of various Chicano organizations across the Southwest and the Bay Area active in the 70s, who were particularly involved in labor organizing, some of which campaigns are talked about in this book. The August 29 movement as an organization, which was founded in 1974, continued to be involved in mass work efforts and labor organizing, even clashing with the notorious reformist Cesar Chavez during a campaign where they were leading a strike of farm workers. By 1978, a split in the organization almost caused it to fall apart, but through the determination and line struggle of its dedicated cadre, it went on to merge with the well-known Asian communist organization, Iwir out of New York, and developed a new organization, the League of Revolutionary Struggle, Marxist-Leninist, likely as a part of following through on their goal, which is mentioned in Fan the Flames, to develop a multinational communist party. Well, I don't exactly agree 100% with everything in this work. I still think it's a pretty solid text and a very valuable example of an analysis of the Chicano national question through a dialectical materialist lens. For nowadays, I'm of the opinion that a question of nationality like this would have to be revisited. The demographic is not what it was in the 70s. Migration patterns have caused a huge shift in the Latino population, and the economy has developed to even more extreme proportions here in the US. Not to mention the indigenous movement, of course, with the land back and everything, which has gained momentum, while the Chicano movement is somewhat hard to spot nowadays. Regardless of all that, this is a great reminder of what the last revolutionary generation left for many Latinos like myself to build off of. Glad this exists, ultimately. Bear with me, everybody. This is an old text on a PDF that was scanned directly. Got the link in the description. But without further ado, I present to all of you Fan the Flames, a revolutionary position on the Chicano national question by the August 29th movement, Marxist-Leninist. The August 29th movement, Marxist-Leninist, is extremely proud to publish this historic document. At a time when the world's peoples are daily dealing blow after blow against the two superpowers of the United States and the Soviet Union, this position stands as a signal declaration of war against US imperialism in particular, a declaration from the class-conscious proletariat and from the Chicano people. The national movement of Chicanos in the southwestern part of the US against national oppression has historically been of a profoundly revolutionary character. It is the duty of all communists, class-conscious workers, and revolutionary nationalists to fan the flames of this movement. At the same time, we must be the hardest fighters for the right of the Chicano nation to political secession. The only way there will ever be a united front of the struggle against imperialism is for communists to respect, advocate, and fight for the right of all oppressed nations to political secession. In the case of Chicanos in the Southwest, who have a history of development dating back over 200 years, there is no other just demand which speaks to their deepest aspirations than the demand for the right of self-determination, political secession. Communists anywhere and always stand for the complete equality and unity of all the oppressed peoples, and we are not advocates of secession. But every Marxist-Leninist who has ever lived has fought for the right of all oppressed nations to political secession as the only way of achieving unity of the peoples and the voluntary union of nations based on equality. The history of past political parties and even of communist organizations regarding their view of the Chicano movement has been shameful for the most part. Most clearly, the quote-unquote Communist Party of the USA has been in the lead of attempting to take the heart out of the revolutionary character of this movement by declaring first, in the 1930s, that Chicanos were not an oppressed nation with the right to political secession, because their territory was, quote, separated by mountains and deserts, end quote. The CPUSA chauvinistically sided with the US imperialists who, of course, would agree 100% with such quote-unquote logic. The past several years have produced a number of documents on this same question, not a one of which can be called Marxist-Leninist. In a future pamphlet we will analyze some of these positions, but what ties them all together from the CPUSA to the October League is the most shallow and superficial treatment of the question, a reformist solution to it, and the denial of the Chicano nation's right to political secession. The August 29th movement, Marxist-Leninist, developed, in large part, out of the revolutionary Chicano national movement. We are proud of our history of striving to give that movement a consistently revolutionary direction. Through our years in that struggle and in joint struggle with revolutionaries from many other movements, we eventually learned of the science of Marxism-Leninism, accepted this science, and became communists. This document represents a concrete application of Marxism-Leninism to the struggle of the Chicanos and of the working class for liberation from the yoke of capitalism. It represents a much broader development of our political line on this most important of questions, and will contribute, we feel, in large part to the development of a revolutionary communist program, so necessary to the genuine unity of Marxist-Leninists and advanced workers into a single vanguard party of the working class. At the same time, we support the struggle to give revolutionary leadership to the Chicano national movement. We recognize that at the heart of the question is the class question and the final quote-unquote solution to the national question. The key to the total liberation and unification of all oppressed peoples is the achievement of socialism. Under socialism, every assistance will be rendered to the economic, political, and cultural growth of the formerly oppressed peoples and nations. Formerly oppressed nations will be given the right to either annex themselves to the socialist state in some suitable form, or to form their own separate state government. But neither the right of political secession or the achievement of socialism and the dictatorship of the working class can be achieved peacefully. In order to smash the brutal rule of capitalism and to establish the armed rule of the working class and oppressed masses, the capitalist state, the entire capitalist system, must be overthrown by the armed working class. But such overthrow is impossible if the working class and oppressed masses do not have their own leadership. A struggle against such a powerful enemy as we face requires that we have an organization of the most dedicated and staunch revolutionaries, a political party that exists for no other reason than to organize and lead the struggle of the masses for socialism and the establishment of state power of the working class. Only a Marxist-Leninist party, a party built on the basis of Marxist-Leninist theory and practicing the self-sacrificing style of work characteristic of Marxism-Leninism historically can lead such a revolution to a victorious conclusion. We do not know how we do not now have such a party, so we must build one. This is the central and most urgent task of every communist and revolutionary in this country. We dedicate this position to the achievement of the task, to the working class, to the heroic Chicano people, and to all the oppressed people and struggling people throughout the world. The proletariat cannot be victorious except through democracy, i.e., by giving full effect to the democracy and by linking with each step of its struggle democratic demands, formulated in the most resolute terms. It is absurd to contrapose the socialist revolution and the revolutionary struggle against capitalism to a single problem of democracy. In this case, the national question. We must combine the revolutionary struggle against capitalism with a revolutionary program and tactics on all democratic demands: a republic, a militia, the popular election of officials, equal rights for women, the self-determination of nations, etc. While capitalism exists, these demands, all of them, can only be accomplished as an exception, and even then in an incomplete and distorted form. Basing ourselves on the democracy already achieved and exposing its incompleteness under capitalism, we demand the overthrow of capitalism, the expropriation of the bourgeoisie, and as a necessary basis both for the abolition of the poverty of the masses and for the complete and all-around institution of all democratic reforms. Some of these reforms will be started before the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, others in the course of that overthrow, and still others after it. The social revolution is not a single battle, but a period covering a series of battles over all sorts of problems of the economic and democratic reform, which are consummated only by the expropriation of the bourgeoisie. It is for the sake of this final aim that we must formulate every one of our democratic demands in a consistently revolutionary way. It is quite conceivable that the workers of some particular country will overthrow the bourgeoisie before even a single fundamental democratic reform has been fully achieved. It is, however, quite inconceivable that the proletariat, as a historical class, will be able to defeat the bourgeoisie unless it is prepared for that by being educated in the spirit of the most consistent and resolutely revolutionary democracy. Imperialism means the progressively mounting oppression of the nations of the world by a handful of great powers. It means a period of wars between the latter to extend and consolidate the oppression of nations. It means a period in which the masses of the people are deceived by hypocritical social patriots, i.e., individuals who, under the pretext of the quote-unquote freedom of nations, the quote-unquote right of nations to the self-determination, and to the quote-unquote defense of the fatherland, justify and defend oppression of the majority of the world's nations by the great powers. That is why the focal point in the social democratic program must be that division of nations into oppressor and oppressed, which forms the essence of imperialism and is deceitfully evaded by the social chauvinists and Kautsky. This division is not significant from the angle of the bourgeois pacifism or the Philistine utopia of peaceful competition among independent nations under capitalism, but it is most significant from the angle of the revolutionary struggle against imperialism. It is from this division that our definition of quote-unquote right of nations to self-determination must follow. A division that is consistently democratic, revolutionary, and in accord with the general task of the immediate struggle for socialism. End quote. LCW, Volume 21. Quick intro from Mosey. LCW stands for Lenin Collected Works. Volume 21. This work often has very big quotes or citations that are also abbreviated, which made sense in the context, but yeah, some of it will require a little bit of Googling from me. Anyways, back to the text. On the revolutionary struggle of the Chicano people. There is no force on the earth which can conquer a people who are fighting for their freedom from oppression. The Chicano people are just such a people, tempered over the decades in the flames of their revolutionary freedom struggle. In our own time, we have seen the courage, strength, determination, and will to freedom of the Chicano masses displayed in the stormy decade of the 60s and up until the present, gaining inspiration from the thousands of Chicano students throughout the Southwest and California who organized into mechas and umas, and who fought for and won the right to study their own history, their culture, and their revolutionary traditions. The Chicano students of the Southwest have formed their own revolutionary fighting organization, Fuerzas Revolucionarias de Aztlán, FRA, which pledges itself to the fight for the deliverance of the Chicano people from the yoke of U.S. imperialism, for the self-determination of their people. In southern Texas, the Chicano rural proletariat in their thousands are living up to the example of Juan Cortina, as they fight the capitalist patrones and the cowardly thugs of the Texas Rangers, the sordid protectors of oppression and exploitation. These heroic farm workers are answering, arms in hand, the violence of the capitalist landowners and their state troopers. These campesinos are proving in the crucible of fire and violence that the Chicano movement contains within itself the seeds of a violent explosion for freedom from imperialist bondage. In northern New Mexico, the campesinos are again cleaning their weapons, faced with never-ceasing violence, faced with never-ceasing imperialist robbery of their land. The campesinos are once more voicing the slogans of the Alianza, Tierra y Libertad. The Alianza, which took up arms and struggled for their precious lands, the earth which gives physical and spiritual nourishment to the Chicano people, these campesinos are even now developing a new form of organization and struggle, La Federación, a united Chicano front formed for the express purpose of fighting in defense of the land of the people. This organization, which included various classes and strata of the masses, has pledged itself to this defense by any means necessary, including armed protection of the land. Circumstances of capitalist oppression, particularly savage persecution by the puppet forces of the state, are forcing the campesinos to stand with their rifles in order to defend their national rights. The anger of the campesinos, seeing and boiling for decades as the imperialist aggressor robs from them the very source of their nationhood, is erupting into open armed struggle in the mountains and villages of northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. The Chicano proletariat, many of them sons and daughters of the campesinos, are moving into the forefront of the national movement. The 3,000-strong Chicano workers from the Fara Manufacturing Company in Texas remained steadfast for almost 2 years after the blows of the industrialists, the bankers, and the state. This bloody coalition of reaction used every weapon in their capitalist arsenal to keep these Chicano workers unorganized, fearing like the plague the loss of the super profits torn from the hands of the Chicano workers from Fara and throughout the Southwest. The imperialists used foreclosures, lies, scabs, arrests, tear gas, and police dogs in a fruitless attempt to break their strike. Realizing that this was no ordinary strike, but part of a movement for freedom, the capitalists frenziedly fought to defend their crumbling edifice of oppression, to deny the end to the Chicano people their basic democratic rights. This denial of rights lies at the heart of the Chicano national movement. Whether to struggle be for the right to organize into unions, to speak their native tongue, to regain their land, to stop the merciless police murder of Chicano veteranos like Roto Canales, Antonio Córdoba, Ricardo Falcón, Florencio Granados, Luis Martinez, and many, many others. For their right to an education, to study and learn their own revolutionary history. The Chicano people are again arising like an armed and angry phoenix from the ashes of the quote-unquote fire that refuses to die, in order to fight until victory for their right to self-determination. What remains the same is the basis of the revolutionary movement, the severe national oppression of the Chicano people, the denial of their basic democratic rights. Like the 60s, the movement will again involve every oppressed class and strata of the Chicano people. The worker, the campesinos, the students, the intellectuals, the youth, the women, etc. What will make this movement different will be its even broader scope and depth. In addition to the revolutionary Chicano proletariat is more and more fulfilling its historic mission as leader of the oppressed, this class, in unity with all American workers, is now in a position to win the confidence and leadership of the national struggle, a position assumed in the 60s by the students. In any case, the revolutionary leaders of the Chicano people have learned the bitter lessons of the past decade, particularly the sad result following the path of the reformist. They have learned, in the factories, in the fields, in the mountains of the Southwest, on the campuses, and in the jails, that only an armed Chicano people can win liberation from imperialism. The intensified repression of the current years gives this new upsurge the potentiality for national rebellion, for an armed revolt of the people in the Southwest. It is the duty, the obligation of every communist, every Chicano revolutionary to prepare for this onslaught, to win. The course of their everyday struggles, the leadership of this movement, the deaths of the Chicano patriots must not have occurred in vain. Their blood must wipe away all illusions of the people that their struggles can occur peacefully, within the confines of the system which robs them and attacks every aspect of their national identity. Let that innocent blood act like a wind upon the fires, fanning the spark of our revolution into conflagration which engulfs the Southwest with the mass rebellion of the Chicano people. Section 2. Annexations are acquired by fire and sword, and the annexation of the Southwest was so achieved. Historically, Marxists have always held to the proposition that economically this was of a historically progressive character, i.e., that capitalism would develop the productive forces of the region, bringing the working class to the fore, the gravediggers of capitalism itself. But Marxists have historically opposed and led struggle in opposition to the brutal and violent oppression that followed the annexation. Even in its most progressive stage, capitalism comes onto the scene dripping with blood from every pore. The blood of countless Indians massacred in greedy wars for land. Blood from millions of blacks kidnapped from Africa, branded and forced into brutal chattel slavery, the cannon fodder of its imperialist wars. Blood from the countless Chicanos who fought to defend their homes, their lands, their dignity. That capitalism, which was born under the slogans of quote-unquote freedom, quote-unquote liberty or death, and quote-unquote all men are created equal, is today the parasite that brutally plunders and exploits not only Chicanos, but peoples throughout the world. Today, as the Chicano movement surges forward, we must grasp the revolutionary lessons of the past in order to know what this movement means today and the direction in which it must proceed. The pages of Chicano history are filled with the heroic struggles of the revolutionary people, who, despite the savage colonization of their homeland, have developed their culture, retain their language and their identity as a people. For 30 years after the annexation, guerrillas roamed the southwest and the west coast in open rebellion against the U.S. They fought to keep their lands, to be able to work their mines, to defend themselves from the racist terror which accompanied the colonization by the Anglo-bourgeoisie. Their heroic exploits under the leadership of men such as Joaquin Murrieta, Tiburcio Vázquez, and El Fego Vaca set the tradition that lives to this day. A lesson we must never forget, that violent oppression must be met with armed resistance. As the struggle continued, its scope broadened. Revolutionaries such as Juan Nepomuceno Cortina came forward. Angered by violent abuses against his people, Cortina called for the general uprising against the racist terrorism. For years, his small army, with the support of the people, drove the forces of the U.S. out of South Texas until numerically superior federal troops under the Colonel Robert E. Lee drove his troops south of the border. But even that didn't stop this revolutionary. In Mexico, he joined Benito Juárez in the fight against French colonialists. When the U.S. Civil War broke out, he organized the Expeditionary Army to fight on the side of the Union, in the struggle to smash the system of slavery which held power in Texas and the South. Returning to Mexico, this undaunted warrior organized the early resistance against the vicious despot Porfirio Diaz. The internationalist traditions set by this revolutionary had struck roots in the movement of Chicanos against oppression. Throughout their history, the central theme of the Chicano struggle has always been the question of land. Whether the struggle was led by the rural proletariat against the capitalist landowners or by the peasantry in its struggle to retain their lands, the question of control of the land has been at the heart of the question around which all other aspects of the national oppression have evolved. The material basis for the national oppression of the Chicano nation lays in the annexation of the Southwest by the U.S., the expropriation of the land and its wealth through fraud and brutal terrorism, together with the super exploitation of the working class and the campesinos through whose toil the riches of the region and super profits for the imperialists were realized. But the campesinos have historically picked up their guns in self-defense of their lands. Las Gorras Blancas of Nuevo Mexico, united with the Knights of Labor in the struggle against the monopoly capitalists whom both saw as the source of their oppression, the Knights of Labor as proletariats, Las Gorras Blancas as campesinos, fighting to keep monopolies from seizing their lands. Through their broad agitation, the campesinos won the support of the masses and used armed self-defense as the basic form to struggle. To the extent that they did so, they were successful in warding off the monopolies. Through this struggle, they laid the basis for founding of El Partido del Pueblo. The armed struggle of Las Gorras Blancas was to continue, although sporadically, until 1926. It may be argued that the conditions for armed insurrection were not yet ripe, that their actions were premature. But this cannot in the least take away from the revolutionary character of that struggle in its early period. And this struggle has lessons for us today. First, it shows us, in embryonic form, the strength of such an alliance between Chicanos and the multinational proletariat. The Knights of Labor were mostly Anglos. But this alliance became eroded as the campesinos, in their justifiable anger against the ruling class, went from viewing the capitalists as the enemy to viewing the Anglos in general as the enemy. This suspicion and hostility weakened the alliance and the struggle of both campesinos and the workers. On the other hand, the Anglo workers, still under the influence of reformist leaders, began to disassociate themselves from the movement due to the often violent character of the struggle. Secondly, the Anglo workers saw the communal land grants not as legitimate property of the campesinos, but as quote-unquote public domain. Under the influence of the reformist illusions put forward by the populist leaders, the Anglo workers failed to recognize that under monopoly capitalism, public domain means monopoly capitalist domain. By failing to recognize this, they weakened the Chicano struggle, their own struggle, and strengthened the cause which oppressed them both, the monopoly capitalists. The lesson to learn from this struggle is that in its struggle for liberation, the movement must clearly see its enemy as imperialism and not Anglo-Americans in general. This is a political struggle for liberation, not race war. In particular, the movement must recognize the multinational working class, Anglos included, as the staunchest allies and supporters of this movement. At the same time, communists and workers of the oppressor nation must recognize the legitimate national rights of Chicanos, including their right to the land, governmental unity, and the right to political secession, i.e., the right to form an independent republic, if Chicanos so choose. The workers of the oppressor nation must be brought to view this question from the stand of the proletariat and not from the standpoint of the bourgeois legality. As the struggle continues to intensify, as rebellions grow toward a national revolt in the Southwest, communists must educate the working class of the oppressor nation as to the legitimacy of such revolts. It is wholly justifiable character, and the proletariat must support this struggle, regardless of who fires the first shot. As Marxist-Leninists, we take the class stand of the proletariat on this question as laid out by the greatest revolutionary of this century, Lenin. Quote, national self-determination is the same as the struggle for complete national liberation, for complete independence, against annexation, and socialists cannot, without ceasing to be socialists, reject such a struggle in whatever right, down to an uprising or war. End quote. Quote, socialists have regarded wars for defense of the fatherland or defensive wars as legitimate, progressive, and just only in the sense of overthrowing alien oppression. This would be just and defensive wars irrespective of who would be the first to attack, and socialists would wish the oppressed, dependent, and unequal state's victory over the oppressor, slaveholding, and predator great powers. End quote. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 23. The final lesson to be learned from the struggle of Las Gorras Blancas is on the question of electoral politics. So long as Las Gorras Blancas kept electoral politics in the background as a subsidiary, at best secondary, form of struggle, they were able to make gains in their struggle for the land. When El Partido del Pueblo came to the fore as the primary form of struggle, the gains made and the struggle itself were doomed to fail. Electoral politics and mass organizations such as El Partido del Pueblo have a role to play in the revolution, one of education and mobilization of the masses for militant political actions. But never should electoral politics become the front as the leading form of struggle. This does nothing less than to condemn the movement to become an appendage of the very system that exploits and oppresses the people. In the struggle of oppressed peoples, we usually find a small group of opportunists who sell their people out to the oppressor nation. Such were the ricos like the Oteros of New Mexico. This class of feudal landlords became transformed into a comprador bourgeoisie, who acted like a middleman for the imperialists in selling the region's resources and the people's labor for super-exploitation. They developed into capitalist businessmen and traveled widely to the East Coast in order to attend bourgeois schools and to be groomed as puppets and to convenience imperialist corporations to exploit the resources of Nuevo Mexico for a cut of the action. Today we still find their successors in the Southwest, such as the Chavezes, the Mondragons. It will be the task of all revolutionaries to expose and isolate these traitors to the national movement, and in the course of the struggle to win the people away from their political puppets, the Jerry Apodacas, the John Montoyas, the Henry Gonzaleses, whose treachery seeks to condemn the Chicano nation to perpetual oppression. At the turn of the century, the Chicano working class was young and small. It had not yet reached maturity to lead the national movement in the Southwest. Instead, the revolutionary elements from the petty bourgeoisie came forward with El Plan de San Diego. This plan was drafted in 1915. While the world raged in throes of an imperialist war, when the revolutionary working class in Russia, Germany, and Hungary was preparing their onslaught against the capitalist oppressors, when the great Chinese masses were raging open rebellion against their colonial masters, when Mexico seethed with tempests of revolution. This plan was set before the movement revolutionary tasks and traditions which we must never forget. They also raised, as part of their program, race war against the Anglos, and this aspect must be totally and firmly rejected today. But this cannot take away from the revolutionary anti-imperialist character of their program. After pledging their lives to carrying out El Plan, these revolutionaries stated in Clause 1, quote, "On the 20th day of February 1915, at 2 o'clock in the morning, we will arise in arms against the government and country of the United States of North America, one as all and all as one, proclaiming the liberty of the individuals of the black race and its independence of Yankee tyranny, which has held us in iniquitous slavery since remote times, and at the same time and in the same manner we will proclaim the independence and segregation of the states bordering upon the Mexican nation, which are Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Upper California, of which states the Republic of Mexico was robbed in the most perfidious manner by North American imperialism." End quote. The transition to capitalism to its imperialist stage has laid the basis, the conditions for a revolutionary national movement. The plan reflected this, the emergence of a new people, evolved under the conditions of and struggle against national oppression. This movement called for an independent republic. Quote, 10. The movement having gathered force and once having possessed ourselves of the states above alluded to, we shall proclaim an independent republic, later requesting, if it be thought expedient, annexation to Mexico, without concerning ourselves at this time about the form of government which may control the destinies of the common mother country. End quote. And so, while recognizing the special relationship to Mexico, the plan called for an independent republic, which could later decide upon its relationship to Mexico. But these revolutionaries sought not only liberation of Chicanos as necessary, but also the liberation of other oppressed peoples as well. Quote, 8. The Apaches of Arizona, as well as the Indians, Redskins of the territory, shall be given every guarantee, and their lands, which have been taken from them, shall be returned to them at the end that may assist us in the course which we defend. End quote. This plan, drafted when the capitalist world was engaged in its rapacious war for redivision of the colonies and oppressed nations of the world, stands out as a shining example to the movement, naming its army the Liberating Army for Races and Peoples. It went on, quote, 11. When we shall have obtained independence for the Negroes, we shall grant them a banner, which they themselves be permitted to select, and we shall aid them in obtaining 6 states of the American Union, which states border upon those already mentioned, and they may form from these 6 states and republic they may, therefore, be independent. End quote. And it ended. Quote, 15. It is understood among those who may follow this movement that we will carry a singing voice the independence of Negroes placing obligations upon both races, and that on no account we will accept aid, either morally or pecuniary, from the government of Mexico, and it need not consider itself under any obligations in this, our movement. End quote. Equality and Independence. San Diego, Texas, January 6, 1915. Inspired by this plan, insurgents arose throughout the Rio Grande Valley and throughout the Southwest, engaging in raids, destruction of bridges, and armed encounters with the Texas Rangers, posses of the U.S. military. They did not, however, carry on a race war. The U.S. government responded with an orgy of violence, arresting Chicanos for treason, lynching and shooting them, jailing them, burning their homes, and forcing the rural population under arms to the urban areas. During that year, over half the population of the valley was forced to leave through brutal terrorism, but no amount of violence has stopped these heroic people from continuing this valiant struggle. No violence of any form has caused Chicanos to disappear as a people, to lose their language, their revolutionary traditions, or their culture. If anything, the struggle against oppression has reinforced their determination, molded their revolutionary leaders, and so long as imperialism oppresses the Chicanos, will continue to rise, with rifles in their fists, to struggle for self-determination. From El Plan de Santiago to El Plan de Aztlán, Chicanos have recognized their legitimate right to political secession, their national rights to land, and to form an independent republic. Those social chauvinists claiming to be Marxist-Leninists, who interpret these heroic struggles as the quote-unquote scheme of petty bourgeois nationalists, must be exposed as traitors, imperialists, and enemies of the working class and oppressed peoples and nations. The Chicanos, a revolutionary people, long ago recognized their right to political independence. It is time that the U.S. communist movement break with its chauvinist past and recognize the legitimacy of this movement and demand for self-determination. Part 3. We live in an era of storms and revolutions. The watchwords of the world's peoples are independence, liberation, and revolution. Since the end of the Second Imperialist World War, the numerous countries of the Third World have risen up in fury against their former colonial and imperialist masters. The last 2 years have seen the peoples of Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and other countries win their liberation in the furnace of People's War. At the same time, the fires of revolution are scorching the imperialist empires as the peoples of Zimbabwe, Azania, and Nambia stand on the threshold of liberation. Elsewhere, the masses of East Timor, the Philippines, Thailand, and Latin America are engulfing their imperialist masters in the smothering embrace of revolutionary struggle. Standing against the mighty current are the two corrupt watchdogs of capitalist reaction, the imperialist United States and the social imperialist Soviet Union. These two bulwarks of oppression, while girding themselves for a world war, with the winner becoming the supreme master of national plunder, are rushing about the world in a frenzy, attempting by hook or by crook to douse the flames of national liberation movements. Set against this violent panorama of world wars and revolutions is the national movement of Chicano people. This movement is a component part of the world revolutionary movement. It derives its significance both from its century-long history of armed struggle and mass upsurge, and from the fact that it is directed squarely against U.S. imperialism from within the very heart of that monster. What is the significance of this struggle for communists and revolutionary nationalists? We are people who have dedicated ourselves to the task of overthrowing imperialism. Today, It is the revolutionary national movement around the world which are dealing the sharpest blows to imperialism, as they put it directly, under the gun. It is not hard to understand, for instance, that the effect upon the imperialists of 200 American cities being put to the torch by the Afro-American national movement of the 60s as revolutionaries, we know the vital importance of a national movement, such as the Chicano people, having a consistent history of armed struggle. As communists, we stand for the interests of the revolutionary working class. This class supports any and every movement which tends to weaken imperialism. The Chicano movement does more than tend to weaken imperialism. It stands ready to drive a stake through the heart of U.S. imperialism. A movement with such a history of struggle, with a rapidly growing working class, with a campesino movement with such revolutionary traditions, stands as the direct ally of the U.S. working class in its struggle for proletarian revolution. It is clear that the national movement and the working class movement are already linked. They are linked in the sense that every blow by the Chicano people against imperialism brings the proletariat a step closer to its goal of socialist revolution. Therefore, we must fan the flames of the Chicano revolution, support it, and strive to give it a consistent and determined revolutionary leadership that it demands from us. Only to the extent that communists prove themselves as fighters for the genuine interests of the Chicano people, only to the extent that they fight and give consistently revolutionary direction in the struggle for land, state unity, and the right of the Chicano nation to political secession, only to the extent that communists prove themselves selfless and devoted fighters in the storm of revolutionary struggle, will they win the confidence of the toiling and oppressed masses of the Chicano people. It is only in the course of revolutionary struggle that the people come to learn that it is not a lack of rights which lies at the root of national oppression, but the system of imperialism, whose economic and political essence is the plunder and exploitation of the nations and peoples. Only in revolutionary struggle do the people learn that capitalism, which was born in the genocidal warfare with the Native Americans, founded on the back of black slave labor, and which grew through plunder, exploitation, and oppression of the Southwest, is capitalism which is carried on the backs of the working class and the oppressed masses, is the root cause of oppression. Only in the course of revolutionary struggle can communists point to socialist revolution as the final solution to the question of national oppression, to show the Chicano masses that only socialism guarantees them their full equality as a people, with the unhindered right to the fullest development of their economy, their language, and their culture. However, we must never make our support for the Chicano national movement contingent on its being a movement consciously directed towards socialism. It is up to the Chicano masses themselves to decide their own destiny. While we must, in the course of the struggle, do the widest agitation and propaganda for socialism, we cannot abandon that movement, abrogate our responsibility to struggle to win the leadership of it, nor oppose it because it is not directed towards socialism. We cannot predict exactly what direction the Chicano struggle will take in the future, whether for independence, for federation, or as part of a direct struggle for proletariat state power. In any case, we are duty-bound to support and to lead that movement. Part 4. The basic demands of the Chicano movement. The root cause of the oppression of the Chicano people is the loss of their land. It's controlled by Anglo-American imperialists. Control of the land gives them also control over the timber, the agriculture, and the mineral wealth of the Southwest. Economic control and political control go hand in hand. Utilizing their political control, they have been able to systemically wrest more and more land from the Chicano campesino through an oppressive system of taxes, their power of eminent domain, etc. This in addition to outright violence and robbery of the lands, as well as squeezing many small farmers out through control of water, timber, and grazing rights. In turn, with the wealth gained from the land, the oppressors expand and strengthen their control, their political rule, which finds its expression in the denial of democratic rights to the Chicano people. To end this vicious system, we must raise the following demands of the Southwest. 1. Expropriation of all of the lands and all natural resources of the Anglo-American capitalists, as well as all those belonging to the federal and state governments. As we have pointed out, the loss of their land forms the basis of Chicano oppression. Loss of their land forces Chicano farming masses into the factories of the oppressors to increase his wealth and consequently his power over the Chicano people. Land taken from the Chicano people produces tremendous mineral, timber, animal, and agricultural wealth for the U.S. imperialists. This control allows the imperialists to keep the Southwest unorganized and therefore a tremendous source of capitalist super profits at the expense of Chicano people, of course. 2. State unity of the Southwest. To maintain their rule, the capitalists have systematically gerrymandered the areas of Chicano majority, roughly from southern Colorado to New Mexico and through to South Texas and southern Arizona and possibly the southeastern part of southern California. Combing into counties huge areas of territory, much of it is sparsely inhabited by Chicanos and Native Americans, with the metropolitan centers that have large Anglo majorities. To make effective the possibility of the Chicano people putting their right to political secession into force, it is required to unite into one governmental unit all these areas of the Southwest where Chicanos constitute a majority of the population. This is to ensure the effective democratic exercise of their right to self-determination. Number 3. Right of political secession, self-determination. This is our central demand in the Chicano liberation struggle in the Southwest. In order to guarantee a revolutionary direction for this movement, and in order to harness the vast revolutionary potential of the Chicano masses, we must raise this demand in opposition to all bourgeois integrationist schemes which preach that hard work or bourgeois education can win Chicanos equality. We must also oppose those forces who say that, quote-unquote, there is no Chicano people, that the Chicano movement is a quote-unquote CIA plot. These forces, who refuse to make these assertions in front of the movement or in a printed public document, claim that Chicanos in the Southwest are actually Mexicanos, a part of the country of Mexico. They desire, therefore, not the right to political independence, but to the reannexation to Mexico. This is the only conclusion to be drawn by thinking people to these forces. It must seem that the Chicano people have not yet earned their right to be called the people. Perhaps more centuries of bloodshed and suffering are required. We must struggle against calls for quote-unquote Chicano socialism. This cover for narrow cultural nationalism tries to accommodate the striving of the Chicano people towards socialism with reformism and cultural nationalism. No, against all this, as well as against all those chauvinists who would deny freedom to the Chicano people because it would, quote-unquote, split the working class. 1. We must call for the complete, unequivocal right of the Chicano people in the Southwest to exercise political control of their territory, as well as to decide upon the relation between their territory and other nations, including the U.S. The right of self-determination means that the Chicano majority in its united territory exercises the right of administering executive, legislative, and judicial authority. It is presently the U.S. imperialists who control this power, the Anglo-American capitalists and landowners. They select all appointed officers, control the public domain, levy and collect taxes, and make all the laws. It is this rule which must be smashed and overthrown if self-determination is to be exercised. Only if the Chicano people lift the burden of imperialism off their backs to the point of determining for themselves their national relationship with all other governments will it win real self-determination. Being that the U.S. imperialists rely ultimately on military force to preserve its rule, we must demand that all U.S. imperialist armed forces be removed from the Southwest. 4. Full democratic rights of all Native Americans in the Southwest must be upheld and fought for, including the right to self-determination where it is applicable. They must be guaranteed the complete rights to all their lands and full water rights for them. 5. Full democratic rights for all Chicanos. This is our main demand in the areas of Chicano concentration, or wherever Chicanos reside and are denied their rights. Outside the Southwest. In the course of our work, we must show that this lack of democratic rights of the Chicano people flows from the forced domination of their homeland. 5. Section 5. A revolutionary armed rebellion by the Chicano people would have an electrifying effect on other national movements here at home, as well as the movement of the revolutionary proletariat. Looking back at the 60s, we can see that the Afro-American liberation movement gave inspiration and impetus to all other progressive movements in this country. The slogans, demands, and tactics of the Afro-Americans were adapted in varying degrees to the struggle of Puerto Ricans, Native Americans, and Chicanos, students, women, veterans, and the working class, etc. The Chicano movement contains the same potential for inspiration and guidance. Particularly, would the Afro-American struggle in the Black Belt South be affected by the Chicano National Revolt, two great peoples whose nations border in part, united by their oppression and their struggle, living in the heartland of their enemy, both with revolutionary histories, with the thread of armed resistance running throughout, both with a growing and militant working class, toiling in the major strategic industries of their enemy. No one can deny the galvanizing effect that armed land seizures by Chicanos would have on the Afro-American people in the South. Beyond the U.S. borders, such a rebellion would shine like a torch of freedom to all the national liberation struggles of the Third World, but most especially to those movements in Latin American countries. These people share much by the way of history, language, and even aspects of culture. The determined and broad Chicano revolutionary movement will give both inspiration and direction to the revolutionary struggles of all the Latin peoples of the Western Hemisphere, much as did the Cuban Revolution of 1959. To no less an extent will the Chicano Revolution inspire the revolutionary working class if systemic agitation and propaganda is done among them, particularly combating all vestiges of chauvinism, explaining the aims of the Chicano struggle. Lacking such work by communists, the racist and reactionary politicos and trade union bureaucrats may succeed in temporarily arousing the hostility of sectors of the Anglo-American workers toward the Chicano struggle, or of channeling their sentiments towards indifference and passivity, precisely when the most resolute supportive actions will be required. Section 6. Outside the Southwest. 1. The thrust of the struggle must be around democratic rights and equality. The areas of struggle should be within the working class, among the students, and against police repression. The forms of organization will arise in the course of the struggles themselves. It is not necessary to draw up blueprints or list of demands now. Demands will flow from the character of the struggle in line with the general line of the August 29th movement. 2. The basic demands of the Chicano movement will not be the starting point of our mass work among Chicanos. The starting point will be the immediate economic and political demands of the specific struggles in line with the August 29 movement's program. In the course of struggle, the source of the oppression of Chicanos will be raised as well as their basic demands. Within the Southwest. 1. The thrust of our work will be around the three basic demands. These demands are not to be raised in a preaching or artificial manner, but are to be patiently explained to the masses in the course of our everyday work with them around the various economic and political issues which they are fighting. 2. We must pay special attention to the struggle of the Chicano peasantry for their land. These struggles have the potential to galvanize and inspire the entire movement. At the same time, they will draw forth the sharpest resistance from the imperialists, as their control of the land lies at the heart of their power. We must train cadre as a special area of work for this task, to be prepared to win the leadership of all forms of this struggle. Preparation and training must include a working knowledge of the history of the area, its traditions, culture, and especially what issues form the central focus of the struggle: taxes, water, timber, or grazing rights, etc. 3. The Chicano working class in the Southwest is often little more than a generation or more removed from the peasantry. As such, they have a strong sense of feeling for the peasant struggle, as well as a sharing the revolutionary traditions of that struggle. At the same time, they bring with them into the proletariat some of the inertia and vacillation of the campesinos. We must utilize their ties with the land to rouse them to a resolute support for the campesinos. We must, as well, fight against every manifestation of national oppression which the Chicanos face as workers: denial of rights to organize, to use their native language, etc. Our basic demands must be raised in the course of leading the struggle around these issues. 4. Chicano women are a rapidly growing sector of the industrial and rural proletariat in the Southwest. They face the triple oppression of class, nationality, and sex. As such, they suffer to the extreme from the yoke of capitalist slavery. We must be the hardest fighters against this oppression, championing every demand aimed against this oppression. We will be required from time to time to formulate these demands ourselves. We must do so without hesitation, foaming our organizing work with broad agitation and propaganda among all workers. Chicano women must learn, especially through our work, of the indispensable role they must play in the liberation struggle of their people and in the movement for the working class. 5. Chicano students played perhaps the largest role of any sector of the people in the Chicano upsurges of the 60s. Due to the present capitalist crisis, many of the gains that they made are being snatched back by the imperialists. We must give direction that they made to the struggle of the students against this, arousing in the course of their work the revolutionary ferment, drawing them actively into the broader struggle of the people, particularly their strong sentiments of support for the struggles of the Chicano workers and campesinos. 6. We must not disdain work in the various mass organizations which are or have arisen in the Southwest. Particularly, we should be prepared to work within the mass political parties, such as La Raza Unida Party, which many of the Chicano masses see as their own. We must turn these organizations into fighting organizations directed towards militant mass actions, and not allow them to become mere electoral machinery or appendages of bourgeois politicians. The tradition of political parties goes back in history to the time of las Gorras Blancas. The mass organizations are potentially excellent source of struggle and revolutionary education. We must not counterpose the vanguard Communist Party to this form of organization, as we would not counterpose the Communist Party to the trade unions. Comrades, this is our resolution, our battle cry, our declaration of war against the U.S. imperialists. It is up to us to make it a living reality, to give life by integrating its truth and direction with the historic revolutionary struggle of the Chicano people. 1. Confiscation of all of the lands and natural resources in the Southwest from the U.S. capitalists. 2. State unity for the Southwest. 3. The right of political secession of the Chicano nation. Chicano National Question, Part 2. The national question in the era of imperialism. The national question in the era of imperialism differs radically from the first period. In the first period, the national question was seen as part of the general question of the bourgeois democratic revolution, an internal state question as part of the national question of the dictatorship of the proletariat. In the second period of the national question, after World War I and the October Revolution, the national question assumed wider scope and became a question of colonies, when it became transformed from an internal political question into a world question. It came to be considered as part of the general question of the proletariat revolution, as part of the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat, Stalin, concerning the national question in Yugoslavia. With the development of capitalism to its imperialist stage, all the contradictions of capitalism are further intensified, including national oppression, imperialism, characterized by the export capital cannot exist without enslaving whole peoples. It cannot survive without exploiting and oppressing nations. This is precisely why the political essence of capitalism, imperialism, is the oppression of nations. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 21, page 409. This then is what changes the character of national movements from the struggle between the bourgeoisie of the oppressor and oppressed nations, from the home market into a struggle of the oppressed masses against imperialism. The conditions of the national oppression under imperialism create the basis for the development of national movements, for national revolts and wars of national liberation. In presenting a solution to a national question, we proceed from an investigation of the national movement, as a movement embracing all classes and strata in its historical development. We analyze the economic and political basis for this movement, its objective relation to imperialism and social imperialism, and what the stand of the proletariat must be. In presenting a solution, we proceed on the basis of facts, not on the basis of formulas. We proceed on the basis of what concretely confronts the proletariat, not on the basis of trying to make reality fit definitions. In an earlier polemic with the Revolutionary Union on the national question, we raised a number of valid criticisms of their position on the Afro-American national question, and exposed them as chauvinist and revisionist. Selected Speeches, 1974-75, August 29th Movement. We dealt on a number of questions, including their revisionist positions on imperialism, a new Third World period in the national question, and on their new definition of what constitutes a nation. We showed how their new definition was not new, but simply an old attempt to liquidate the national question. This was valid, but the stress of our polemic should have focused on the national question in the area of imperialism and the Revolutionary Union's distortion of Marxism-Leninism on this question. Instead, while raising this and many other questions, we zeroed in on the definition of a nation and on the criteria for nationhood as laid out by Comrade Stalin in the first period of the national question. This reflected our incomplete grasp of the national question at the time. Through struggle, we arrived at the approach reflected in this resolution. This is especially important to grasp today, when the principal contradiction in the world is the national question, i.e., the struggle between imperialism and Soviet social imperialism on the one hand and the oppressed peoples of the world on the other, when the Third World is the stormy center of the world revolutionary movement. Characterization of the Chicano national movement. As we have pointed out, the Chicano national movement is objectively a revolutionary movement directed at imperialism. The solution to the national oppression of the Chicano people cannot proceed except through a revolutionary struggle to overthrow the rule of imperialism and establish the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is precisely why the movement places before the communist movement the obligation to support it and to lead it. The character of the movement has centered around democratic demands for land, jobs, equality of languages, an end to discrimination in housing, education, and jobs, for the right to organize unions for economic opportunities by bourgeois and petty bourgeois forces, etc. The struggle to attain these demands has often flared up into armed confrontations with the state, but this movement today cannot be characterized as a national liberation struggle. A struggle for secession and the formation of an independent state. Nevertheless, the question of secession has run like a thread throughout the history of this national movement, from the time of the annexation to this very day, and it is not now for communists to stand in the way of the aspirations of the Chicano people if they choose the path of secession. Rather, it would be our task to lead that movement and to connect it to the general proletariat struggle and our ultimate aim of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Over the last decade, the issue of secession has been a burning question in the national movement and has been one of the main focuses of the discussion at conferences and national meetings of the national movement. At no time has the national movement given up this right, but it instead has consistently upheld it time after time, even to the point of guerrilla warfare. What has been lacking is the leadership role of communists in that movement and a genuine communist party to weld the movement of the oppressed nationalities and the multinational proletariat and lead them on the path to proletariat revolution. What has steered the movement away from a revolutionary course down the path of reformism? It has been the social props of imperialism, the reformists and revisionists who have exerted great influence in the national movement and who have used everything in their power to shore up the crumbling rule of the imperialists. These enemies of the proletariat revolution have tried different tactics to cover themselves with every revolutionary mask imaginable to do their dirty work. We will unmask these traitors in future polemics. For now, it is enough to point out their evil ways and to reaffirm their role that the reformism plays in the Chicano national movement, that it represents the main danger to that movement. Leading the pack of these reformists and revisionists is the CPUSA, which negates the existence of the Chicano nation, posing the solution to the oppression of the Chicano people as a struggle for reforms. Falling in a step behind the CPUSA are the quote-unquote Revolutionary Communist Party, RCP, and the October League, LOL, neither of which have much real influence in the Chicano movement at this time. Both of them raise the call for regional autonomy in the Southwest as a way of throwing crumbs to the oppressed masses of the Chicano nation who hunger for an end to imperialist rule in the Southwest, only to tell the masses that they must wait in the socialist revolution to practice that autonomy, and until then they will have to be contented with a long-lasting list of reforms which these groups always raise. Only somewhat different is the Communist Labor Party, CLP, which does the same based in the Southwest and which pays lip service to regional autonomy, only to embrace the labor bureaucrats and reformists in order to concentrate on building their infamous united front against fascism. Within the national movement itself, the reformists have found that the growth of revolutionary consciousness among the masses has made it impossible to hold sway in the movement with their old bag of tricks. Previously, it was enough to denounce white people as the enemy to keep their leadership in the movement, masking their reformism with nationalism and mysticism. The cultural nationalists today often attack the Marxist-Leninists, who are in fact the only ones capable of leading the Chicano people out of their oppression. Some of these more militant reformists even go as far as to call for Chicano socialism, quote unquote. In a futile attempt to postpone the formation of revolutionary alliance of movements of oppressed nationalities with that of the multinational working class, these forces even use a little terrorism, sometimes aimed at the oppressors and sometimes aimed at honest revolutionary elements which they see as a threat, to make them appear genuinely revolutionary and to make more appealing their own package of reforms. Even the poverty pimps, whose very existence depends on the continued survival of imperialism, often speak of revolution. Quote unquote, it's just not time yet. While telling the masses to patiently wait for the handouts from their imperialist oppressors. Posing a real danger to the revolutionary direction of the movement are also the centrists and right opportunists who have become the mouthpieces of revisionism in the Chicano national movement. They claim that the Soviet Union is still a socialist country, that social imperialism does not exist, and that the movement should tie itself to this natural ally. They praise the aggressions of this enemy of the world's people. For example, they laud the role played by the Soviet Union in Angola, and climb into bed with the CPUSA, offering Chicanos only a reformist line disguised with a revolutionary phrase, going as far as to call for a Mexican Communist Party in hopes of weakening a genuine party-building movement and diverting the national movement from the revolution. The leading proponent of this line is CASA, Centro de Acción Social Autónomo, which tries its best to infect honest elements with its threatened line. What is the common thread flowing through all these various lines? Reformism. The vile lie that somehow the oppression of Chicano people can be brought to an end without the armed overthrow of the rule of the imperialists, without the seizure of the state power, and without the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Instead of this, the reformists offered the Chicano people a long list of partial demands, which at best can only make life under capitalism more bearable. Precisely because of this, and because of the influence which reformism holds on the national movement, we say that it is reformism and not narrow nationalism that constitutes the main danger in the Chicano national movement. It has been in spite of these forces that the national movement has upheld its right to political secession and the common thread of armed struggle to the present day. The armed struggle has, however, been restricted to guerrilla and terrorist tactics, and as yet, the national movement has not taken to armed struggle for political secession, although it has supported it within its ranks. Yet, it has a history of such struggle, and conditions for a national revolt have not diminished but have increased, making the upsurge of a national liberation struggle a very strong possibility in the near future. If communists are to do their utmost for the revolutionization and building of this movement, and to direct it towards socialism, they must leave the struggle against reformism and revisionism within the national movement. Particular questions. Economy of the Chicano nation. The statistical data provided in this document shows that there exists a thin layer of small capitalists within the Chicano nation, as well as outside the Southwest, and that they are into almost every area of the economy, from agriculture to manufacturing and banking. However, their share of the home market is fractional, 2.3 billion in annual revenues, with the imperialists in firm control of this market. Within the boundaries of the US multinational state, this is precisely what is to be expected. We are talking, after all, about an oppressed nation, oppressed in every sphere of social life. To make the right to self-determination contingent upon the consolidation of the home market is to fall into imperialist economism and chauvinism. If one were to be consistent on this question, we would then have to reject the legitimacy of the majority of the national liberation struggles throughout the world over the last 20 years. For where we find the imperialists and colonialists allowing the free development of the characteristic features of a fully developed nation, such as a common economy, developed and consolidated by the colonized people. Nor would we find in many African countries one common language, but many different languages, etc. To hold to such an absurd proposition would be to liquidate the national question on a world scale. When Comrade Stalin outlined the development of modern nation-states in Western and Eastern Europe, he showed how nations were a historical category belonging to the epoch of rising capitalism. In the second period of the national question, in the era of imperialism, the national question is broadened out to include the question of colonies and oppressed nations outside Europe. In this new era, the national question is part of the general question of the proletariat revolution, and as we pointed out above, it is no longer a struggle of the home market which characterizes the essence of the question, but the struggle of the oppressed people against imperialism. That system which cannot survive except by exploiting and oppressing the majority of the world's peoples, the oppressed nations and colonies. Quote, what significance can the competitive struggle between the bourgeoisie of different nationalities have when the national question is presented in that way? Certainly not a decisive significance, and, in certain cases, not even important significance. It is quite evident that the main point here is not that the bourgeoisie of one nationality is beating or may beat the bourgeoisie of another nationality in the competitive struggle, but that the imperialist group of the ruling nationality is exploiting and oppressing the bulk of the masses, above all the peasant masses, the colonies, and dependent nationalities, and that, by oppressing and exploiting them, it is drawing them into the struggle against imperialism, converting them into allies of the proletariat revolution. End quote. Stalin, The National Question, once again. An argument that some have used to restrict the right to self-determination is to claim that this right can only be exercised where capitalism has developed the nations and given rise to bourgeoisie and proletarian forces. Lenin viewed the matter differently. Quote, but even with regard to colonial countries, where there are no workers, only slave owners and slaves, the demand for self-determination, end quote, far from being absurd, is obligatory for every Marxist. End quote. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume 23, page 64. Isn't it clear here that Lenin is speaking of countries where there obviously is no capitalist class fighting for the home market, but where the masses of the people still have the right to overthrow the alien rule of the imperialists? It was precisely for holding such views that Lenin was attacked by the social chauvinists of his day for inventing, quote-unquote, cases for the application of the right of self-determination. But let's look to see what actually exists in the Southwest. What we find is that economic cohesion in fact exists. The export of capital into the Southwest broke down the isolation and self-sufficiency of the scattered towns and villages, established commercial and manufacturing centers, trade between town and country, class divisions corresponding to the development of capitalism, transportation, and communication of the towns throughout the Southwest. The second argument raised by social chauvinists in the U.S. in that Lenin is speaking of colonies, not of oppressed nations. Yet they cannot point to any fundamental difference in the presentation of the question of colonies and oppressed nations with regard to the right of self-determination. Lenin's Collected Works, Volume 23, page 21. In Lenin's day, the social chauvinists opposed the right of self-determination of the colonies because they were not fully developed, quote-unquote, civilized nations. Lenin Collected Works, Volume 23, page 23. In the U.S., today, social chauvinists reject the right of self-determination of the Afro-Americans and Chicano nations because they are not colonies and must be treated fundamentally different. We see that social chauvinism is very flexible, adaptable, and to the service of imperialism, regardless of the time and place. Do Chicanos constitute a nation or a colony? The period following the annexation of the Southwest found the Chicano masses under the heel of military rule. During this period, Chicanos were not assimilated into the Anglo-American nation, as was the case with European immigrants, nor has this assimilation taken place today in the historical homeland of the Chicano people, contrary to the CLP's claims. Instead, what we find is a barbaric national oppression, military rule, and direct rule by the oppressor nation. Economically, the Southwest was not yet assimilated into the economy of the U.S. to any great extent. This can be characterized correctly as the time when Chicanos did in fact constitute a colony of the U.S. to some extent. Vestiges of colonialism existed until 1912, when New Mexico was admitted into the Union as the 48th state. The case today is different. Formally, Chicanos are not under military rule. They have the quote-unquote legal right to elect representatives to legislative bodies of local, state, and federal levels, to serve on juries, etc. In actual fact, however, what we find is gerrymandering, repression of the Spanish language and the Chicano culture, police terrorism, job and educational discrimination, robbery of Chicano lands, etc. This in fact characterizes the political relationship between the oppressor nation and the Chicano people. Economically, the export of capital to the Southwest and consolidation of the border region market shows us that the economy of the Southwest does not represent an integral whole distinct from the economy of the U.S. For these political economic reasons, Chicanos do not constitute a colony but an oppressed nation within the boundaries of the U.S. What are the boundaries of the Chicano nation? This decision is not one which the communist movement can decide today. As comrades Lenin and Stalin laid out, this is to be decided by the inhabitants of the region on the basis of their common culture, economic, political, and language characteristics, etc. But there are a few questions we will now raise in this regard. First, the basis for the boundaries of an oppressed nation within the U.S. borders cannot be decided on the basis of nose count, quote-unquote. To do so is to often restrict that nation to the most economically underdeveloped regions, depriving it of the industrial center, ports, etc. The basis for the defining borders must be democratic and in the spirit of proletarian internationalism. This implies that the actual boundaries of the Chicano nation extend further than simply those areas where Chicanos or Afro-Americans constitute majorities in their historical homelands. What is a Chicano? Generally, this question would not arise, but one of the particularities of Chicanos is that they inhabit a border region which shares considerably with Mexico by way of history and culture. But given this, Bundist forces like Casa have laid out that Chicanos are in fact part of the Mexican nation, and the implications flowing from this, the need for a Mexicano Communist Party in the US, which of course is to be the duty bound to sleep by the C, quote-unquote, PUSA, and La PSP, and the obligation of Chicanos to organize solely Chicanos. The preposterous proposition, whose chief exponents are Casa, are the puppets of the quote-unquote CPUSA in the Chicano national movement, flies in the face of the historical development of Chicanos as a people and the development of the Mexican nation. The Mexican nation is the result of three revolutions: the War of Independence of 1811 to 1821, the liberal bourgeois revolution de la Reforma led by Benito Juárez, and the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920. Chicanos in the Southwest were not part of these revolutions, and only a handful minimally participated in the 1910 revolution. Chicanos as a people developed under different historical conditions. Those of colonization, of national oppression within the borders of the U.S. The Mexican masses, for example, do not suffer from racial or national discrimination. The Spanish language is not suppressed in Mexico, but is the quote-unquote official language. The Mexican culture is not systemically attacked by the state. The Mexican masses study their own history and their native language, etc. Further, the Chicano masses are much further removed from feudalism than the rural Mexican population. All of these form part of the material conditions of quote-unquote life, which are reflected in the psychological makeup of the people, reflected in their culture. These particular conditions of oppression have given rise to a distinct psychological makeup, although there are some similarities to Mexican culture, reflected culturally in their language, their art, their music, etc. Conclusion. This second part of our resolution is meant to be taken together with part 1 of the resolution and the historical exposition of the question. We merely wanted to deal here superficially with certain specific questions which will help to put our position into proper perspective. So that'll about do us for part 1 right there. Basically what we just read was a rundown of the August 29th movement and where they stand on the Chicano national movement, as well as in the communist movement in the US in the 70s. We got to know a little bit of the organization, how it formed, and what their stances in particular are. Standing out among these is the desire to build a multinational communist party, which not something I disagree with, but not something I would necessarily stress as intensely as they did there. As Latinos in particular, we got a lot of issues to square out in our community, I believe, which we can do in solidarity with other nationalities before just being able to throw ourselves into a multinational movement like that, especially for a territory like the US, which the divisions have only become more defined in the last few years, few decades of struggle. Additionally to this, we got a little bit of exposure to the Chicano national history and how the movement got built, and it's not super in depth. I'm guessing this section was more than anything to hype up the reader for what is to come and to truly rouse their interest in order to be able to want to dig further and understand further the history of the Chicano movement and the particular need for this specific struggle waged by the August 29th movement. Overall, I hope you find this section very informative. Bear with me for sometimes, as I said earlier, it's hard to read as this is a direct Xerox copy of of the book itself. And yeah, some of the words can be cut off, some of the quotes can be hard to see, so sometimes it's hard to tell what's in quotes and what isn't until the very end when something's cited. And yeah, as well as the acronyms, which they do a pretty good job of mentioning the acronyms, but sometimes they kind of just appear standing alone. Anyways, yeah, hope you guys enjoyed the read, and catch me on part 2. Once again, this is your friend Mosey, and checking out.